Yeah, okay. So I just want to quickly deal with kind of what I've noticed so far with the Quran as a text, in terms of what I think it is, given kind of its compilation. Now, I don't, I haven't read through the entire thing, but from what I'm noticing from different conversations that I've had and different kind of chapters and verses that I've read or maybe people have brought up in the past, um, one thing that seems to be very clear is that the Quran, strangely enough, it utilizes and relies heavily upon a huge amount of apocryphal work, which is very strange. So, for example, we're gonna go through some of those examples in a moment, but it seems as if the Quran seems to think that the apocryphal work is scripture, which I don't know why that is, because these apocryphal texts, most of which are in the Quran, by the way, are products of the period between the first century CE and the time of Muhammad. So, in other words, there's nothing really in the Quran before the first century CE. It's predominantly apocryphal works produced first century CE up until the time of Muhammad, which is very, very strange because these are works that, for those who don't know, are rejected by both Jews and Christians as being heretical, as being apocryphal. So my question then would be is why do they find themselves in the Quran, right? Why is there a compilation of these in the Quran? And not only that, why do they appear in a redacted form, right? And I'll explain what I mean in a second. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay. Um, okay. I just want to make sure that this works. Yes. So I'm going to give a quick example here. So, in this particular chapter of the Quran, chapter 32, verse 11, it says, "Say, O Prophet, your soul will be taken by the angel of death who is in charge of you, then to your Lord you will be returned." Now, I don't know if people are aware, but the angel of death, this kind of concept, it's from an apocryphal text from the first century, from the second century, called the Apocalypse of Peter, which I'm going to show in a moment. So this angel of death figure is referred to as Azrael. Now, I don't know if they mention it in the tafsirs. I'm curious to see if they do bring it up. Yes, they do. Very interesting. Israel. So that's obviously the Aramaic or the Arabic version of it, but in the original, it's Azrael, or in the Arabic, Israel. So this angel of death figure. Now, this angel of death figure is a product of the second century, and it's found in what's called the Apocalypse of Peter, which I'm just going to quickly show right now. So if we look at this, I'll just make sure I'm on the right text. Yeah, this is the Apocalypse of Peter. Should be here somewhere. I'll just do a quick word search for it. How do we do that? Just bear with me a second. Search with Google. How do I do this? There's a way of searching for words. I don't know if it's an extension or what's this thing doing to me? History does done. Okay. Print. Search with Google Lens. Oh, find. Here we go. Okay. Okay, this isn't helping. Okay, we're just going to quickly go through it and see if we can find it. But I'm just going to show what this thing is getting at when it speaks of the angel of death and where its origin is found. So we're just going to quickly work through it. The angel of God who are with me. Shall bring forth the souls of those who are. Yes, here he is, Ezrael. So this is the figure that's adopted in the Quran. So in that particular chapter, chapter 32, verse 11, when it talks about the angel of death, and we saw from the we saw from the what's it called, the tafsir, that this is referring to Israel, which is the Arabic version of Etzrael, right? Which is the, you know, this is the original form in the Apocalypse of Peter. Now, the Apocalypse of Peter, as I said, is a 2nd century product, right? It's effectively a heretical text that was produced by a heretical group, and this text ends up coming up in the Quran. Like, it's obviously the Quran is pulling from it. However, the Quran is also redacting it. And you find, this is the thing that you find with these apocryphal works, is that when the Quran quotes them in any shape or form, you can link it back to the original text, but you can also see that the text has been edited heavily. So I'll give you an example of what I mean. So if we go to chapter, if I'm not mistaken, it's chapter 16. Draw near to so could be 17. I'm just going to see if I can find this quickly, because I found this quite profound. And this, by the way, comes up quite consistently when I'm looking at these apocryphal texts and I'm comparing them in their original form with how they appear in the Quran. Yes. Now, see what he says in chapter 16, right? He says, I saw many fruits, right? I saw many fruits, and my Lord and God, Jesus Christ, said to me, have you seen the companies of the fathers? So he says, and my Lord and God, Jesus Christ. So the author of the Apocalypse of Peter views Jesus as God, right? And he has that, in the original form. Now, the redacted form of this text, which is found loosely in the Quran, because this is where this theology of the angel of death, Etzrael, comes from. As I said, it's edited, right? Because like this text views Jesus as God, yet according to the Quran, obviously Jesus is not God. Meaning, this has been changed in order to suit the theology of the Quran. That's just one example, but it's very strange that the Quran is doing that. And by the way, you can check all these things. Remember, the Quran is a product of. Okay, if I grant it, it's due, let's just say, I'll say a 7th century product, but I mean, it's been argued that it's an 8th century product. But anyway, that's besides the point. And some have even argued that the Quran effectively is a text that was already in circulation before the time of Muhammad, which Muhammad then edited through scribes, let's just say, in order to fit himself into the revelation, let's just say. So yeah, this is one example. Right, so this appears in the Quran, and its first appearance outside of the Quran is in an apocryphal work that was rejected in the 2nd century called the Apocalypse of Peter, right? And in that particular Apocalypse of Peter, that apocryphal work, Jesus is referred to as God. Strange. Why doesn't he have that part in there? But yet he has this part. Very, very suspect, right? Yes. So let us go to. Oh, what is this? Surah Maida, verse 110. Yes. So what's interesting here, right, is this is Surah Al-Maida, verse 110, right? In this particular chapter, it says that Jesus played with these clay pigeons or whatever. So, and he breathed into them, and they became living, effectively. Now, why is that strange? Well, similar to the Apocalypse of Peter situation, that particular narrative of Jesus playing with the clay pigeons and them coming to life is taken from an earlier Gnostic source, and it's called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas. So I'm just going to quickly go to that. Here it is. This is the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, by the way. So look, it says here, right, in section 3, right? Jesus made 12 sparrows from that clay. It was a Sabbath, and one child ran and told Joseph, saying, "Look, your boy is playing by the stream and making birds from the clay, which is not lawful." And having heard, he went and said to the boy, "Why are you doing these things, profaning the Sabbath?" Jesus did not answer him, but looking at the sparrows, he said, "Go, take flight and remember me, living ones." And with the word, they took flight and went away into the air. So in the original version of this particular text, Jesus, by his word, he tells them to take life, and they obey the word of Christ, right? Again, that's actually, by the way, a symbol of deity in some sense, right? That he commands, and by his word, things happen, right? And by the way, that seems to be what the author of the Infancy Gospel of Thomas gets at. Now, the Infancy Gospel of Thomas isn't scripture, by the way, but it's interesting that this second century text is utilized in the Quran, right? So, Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 110. But similar to the Apocalypse of Peter, where did I think I've lost it? Am I? Oh, sorry. Oh yeah, here it is. Similar to the Apocalypse of Peter, right? There's instances in this particular gospel where Jesus is worshipped. Okay, so I'm just going to quickly show you, guys, because I think that this is very interesting. Just quickly find it here. Lord rebuked, knocked, refusing some. One second. I just want to find. There's a nicer version of this where it's like easier to read. I'm just gonna quickly see if I can find it. Yes, it's this one. This is the one I was looking for. So, where is it? Just bear with me for a second. And I'm going to show you the points in this that are very interesting because Jesus is actually worshipped. Yeah, here we go. So this is chapter 9, right? So remember how in chapter 16 of the Apocalypse of Peter, Jesus is recognized as Lord and God, and then in the Quran, it's obviously it's taking from that text, but there's no mention of the fact that Jesus is God. Why? Because it seems like the author is trying to obviously fit this into his own theology, right? So in the original Infancy Gospel of Thomas, again, this is an apocryphal work, by the way. In the original Infancy Gospel of Thomas, there's instances where the child Jesus is worshipped. Now, listen to this, right? This is chapter 9. And the parents of the child praised God and worshipped the child Jesus. Now, why doesn't that appear in the Quran? Very suspect, right? Now, there's also a second instance where he's worshipped again. I'm not too worried if I can't find it, but I just wanted to at least show one of them to kind of get the message across here. Heals. Yes, chapter 18. So look at what it says, right? And seeing a man lying dead, he, being Jesus, seized the man's hand and said, I tell you, man, rise and do your work. And he, the man, immediately rose and worshipped him. So this is quite strange, right? Because in the original Jesus is worshipped, in the original Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which the Quran is pulling from, but then obviously in the Quran itself, there's no mention of that. Okay, so like this is what I'm talking about in terms of the redaction, the edits that were made. So, like, look at this. It says in regards to these things, right? Notice what the Quran does, right? It mentions kind of the same narrative, but it adds in stuff like by my permission. In other words, it's like trying to make it obvious. Again, oh Jesus, son of Mary, right? Son of Mary as opposed to son of God, right? Or son of man. It's trying to make it appear as if Jesus was a mere messenger that could only do these things by the power of God, by the power of Allah, let's just say by his permission. But the original Infancy Gospel of Thomas doesn't portray it as that way. It actually portrays it as Jesus, the child Jesus, having the authority innate of himself to do these things. And when he manifests his divine authority, which he has innate of himself, not that he has to ask permission for these things to happen, the response by the people who see it is they immediately worship him. But yet in this redacted form, it takes out all that. It takes out the worship bit, and it just says effectively that he could only do these things by permission. So this is just an example of how this text was heavily redacted. Now, the same obviously is with Surah Sajda 11, right? Chapter 32, verse 11. Angel of death situation, right? Taken from the Apocalypse of Peter. But in the original text, in the original Apocalypse of Peter, Jesus is referred to in chapter 16 as Lord and God. But yet in this redacted version, no mention of that. Now, with Surah Al-Ma'idah verse 110, the redaction is even worse because there's more that's put in there to suit the theology of the Quran, which is that Jesus cannot be God. Right, but in the original Gnostic texts, which predate the Quran, because these are second century texts, most of them, some of them are later, which we'll look at in a moment. Those texts have the worship of Jesus. In other words, they elevate Jesus to a divine level. Now we can argue exactly the meaning of that, theologically speaking, but the authors of these texts clearly view Jesus as divine or equal or like God in some sense, similar enough to God that people are willing to get down on their hands and feet and worship him. So, but obviously the Quran doesn't mention that. It takes from these texts, but it also alters them. But remember, the point I just want to quickly make before I move on to the next example is that these are apocryphal works. They were not accepted by the Jews or the Christians as scriptures. These were rejected works, right? Because they were deemed heretical. But even in these heretical texts, which the Quran is seemingly pulling most of its so-called revelation from, Jesus is portrayed not as a mere messenger. He's actually portrayed as divine, because we just saw child Jesus being worshipped. Apocalypse of Peter, he's referred to Lord and God. Okay, so chapter 18, verse 50. Okay, this one I actually found out quite interesting. I found out rather recently, and I was quite surprised by this. So in chapter 18, verse 50, it talks about the situation with Adam and Eve being cast out of Jannah, right, outside of heaven, according to the Muslim tradition, right? And Iblis, which is Satan, was also cast out. And the reason is because he didn't prostrate himself before Adam. Now, what's interesting about this is that this narrative, again, it's because when you read the original Genesis narrative, this has zero similitude with it pretty much. It's its own kind of standalone thing. So it's not pulling really from Genesis, it's pulling from something else. And the question is, what is that thing? Well, it turns out that what it's pulling from is, as we'll see in a second, yes, it's here. This is a text called The Life of Adam and Eve, right? And if I'm not mistaken, I think it's a first century product. While the surviving versions were composed from early 3rd to 5th century, the literary units that are in work, there is wide. Okay, now I know. Look, by the way, I know Wikipedia is not the best source to use, but it's good for like a quick kind of search. But it does give. So Wikipedia does give the scholarship behind it, so you can actually check the sources for yourself to see if it's right. But according to Wikipedia, this book, this text, The Life of Adam and Eve, it says there's wide agreement among scholars that the original was composed in a Semitic language in the 1st century AD. Now, what does the Life of Adam and Eve say, according to this? Because remember, the Genesis narrative in the Bible is very different, because in Genesis, it just says that Adam and Eve were in Eden, which was actually on earth, by the way, not in paradise, and that they were cast out because they sinned, effectively. It had nothing to do with Satan not willing to prostrate himself before Adam. So, again, this is mirroring what you find in the Quran, right? Michael himself worshipped first, then he called me and said, worship the image of God, Jehovah, right? Now, that's very interesting, right? Because in this version, it says that Adam is in the image of God. He's in the image of Jehovah, right? Strangely enough, that doesn't appear in the Quran either. Yeah. So he says, I do not have it within me to worship Adam. When Michael compelled him to worship him, he said, why do you compel me? I will not worship him who is lower and posterior to me. I am prior to that creature. Before he was made, I had already been made. He ought to worship me, right? So this is the arrogance of Satan not willing to worship Adam, apparently, because he's commanded to. I think there is something else that was quite interesting in this. Anyway, so you get the point, right? This particular narrative, which is found in the Quran, where is it? Here, right? In chapter 18, verse 50, it's taken from a 1st century Jewish apocryphal text called The Life of Adam and Eve. Again, that's not found in the original scriptures. Like, in other words, the view that scholars have of this text, like the other texts that I've spoken about already, is that these are apocryphal texts. So with this one, this was a product. In other words, it came into existence in the first century by some person, by some heretical group that wrote it down, right? The same also applies to the infancy gospel of Thomas and the apocalypse of Peter. These were heretical people who, wrote this material down. They believed they had whatever revelation from God or whatever, and they wrote it down. But it was produced in that time period. So my point being that if the narrative that's found in the Quran, which is ripped straight from the life of Adam and Eve, as we've just seen, if this is the original, right, why is there no mention of it before the first century? Because that would lead a scholar to conclude that this is a first century product and nothing more. If this was the original narrative, right, let's just say the original Genesis narrative, then why is there no text before the first century that has this story in it, and it's just unique to this period in time? That's why a scholar would look at this and say, well, this was the product of a heretical group at the time, a Jewish heretical group who came up with this. Similar with Enoch, even though Enoch does go back to BC. But anyway, that's besides the point. My point being that there's no, since the Genesis narrative, is a narrative that goes back, thousands of years, but way before this text was produced, then we should have evidence of this narrative before the first century, since the Genesis narrative was one of the first narratives that was actually written down among some others. But anyway, we don't have it, so that would just imply what the Quran did was it mistook this as the original Genesis narrative, ripped it, and then put it into its text. And then the reason I say ripped it is because it doesn't mention anything in the Quranic version that Adam is made in the image of God, right? In the image of Jehovah. And by the way, that does say Jehovah, but according to Muslims, you don't call God Jehovah. You'd refer to him as Allah, right? So, again, you can check it. Everything that I brought up here, you can check it in your own time. Yes, so this one I want to look at as well. This is Surah Al-Nisa, verse 157, right? Which talks about the crucifixion. It says effectively that Jesus was not crucified, right? And one of the most common interpretations of this verse is it hints towards substitution, that someone else was made to look like Jesus and put on the cross, while Jesus kind of got off scot-free, let's just say. Now, there's no document from the first century, by the way, where this particular narrative is put forth. Okay, so every first century text that we have, and I'll just give an example of just some sources that are important that can be checked and verified. I have them written down. So, just as a quick example, right? I'm just going to give some of the most critical scholars that have actually looked into this issue. Bart Ehrman, in his 2008 book, A Brief Introduction to the New Testament, on page 136, he says effectively that based on all the evidence that historians have, all the documentation from the first century, that it's a historical fact for him that Jesus was crucified. John P. Meyer, 2006, in his book, How Do We Decide What Comes from Jesus? The Historical Jews in Recent Research, pages 126 128, he says it's a historical event. John Dominic Crossan, in his 1995 book, in his 1995 book, Jesus, A Revolutionary Biography, page 145, he says it's a historical fact, right? And just one final one. In Ehrman's 2012 book, Did Jesus Exist? Page 126 to 270. Sorry, page 269 to page 270. He says nearly all critical scholars agree on these points about the historical Jesus, referring to the crucifixion, among some other points like the baptism and stuff. But the views that scholars have, based on all the evidence from the first century, is that Jesus was in fact absolutely crucified. And there's no narrative that suggests otherwise. The only narratives that suggest otherwise are second century products in line with the kind of Gnosticism that we've looked at already in the infancy gospel of Thomas, since there was a production of these Gnostic texts in the 2nd and 3rd century. Strangely enough, the same text which the Quran is absolutely borrowing from, which is very strange, because you kind of have to give a justification for that, is that if these were the original narratives, why don't they appear in the first century? Why are they later products, right? It just seems like the Quran is taking without understanding what it's taking from. So the crucifixion being denied, right? I just brought up that the historians and the scholars agree that he was crucified based on all the evidence. There's also a source by Flavius Josephus called the Flavium Testimonium. Now, there is debate over whether that text has interpolation in it or not, Christian interpolation or whatever. But the majority position within scholarship, what most scholars go with, is that, and by the way, I'm just going to give the source for that. It's in Ehrman's recent video. He talks about it. Bart Ehrman. Yes, so it's in this one. Jesus in the writings of the first century Jewish historian Josephus. So he goes through the source itself, right? And in that video, you can watch it in your own time. He explains how most scholars agree that the part in that when it talks about Jesus being crucified is original to Josephus, that he did write that in a neutral way, that Jesus was crucified. And it's for that reason that historians regard it as a historical source that's accurate when referring to Jesus. Now, there is a little bit of interpolation in that. He does agree. So in other words, the view that scholars have is it's partly interpolated. But the part where it talks about Jesus being crucified under Pilate, that part is regarded as original to Josephus, because the style of writing in that part in specifically is in line with how Josephus writes. Anyway, so that's just kind of the point I wanted to make. So the question then is, so where's the Quran getting this from, right? Because the first century tells us he was crucified. All the documentary evidence that we have from Josephus, from Tacitus, to the Gospels themselves. By the way, it doesn't matter if you view the Gospels as corrupt or not. Historians can still look at the Gospels and use them as a historical record, since they do have historical data in them. Yes, you can argue that there's severe interpolation there, but historians have methods by which to extract, at least for them, through their kind of naturalistic methodology, the most kind of accurate historical account they can derive from the text. So, for example, with the Bible, and when people try and reconstruct who the historical Jesus was, they'll use things like the criterion of dissimilarity, the criterion of embarrassment, and those kind of very critical criterions in order to come to kind of a try and come to what a historical representation, what they believe to be the most historical representation of Jesus himself. Anyway, so back to this. So as I said, majority of scholars agree based on the evidence that Jesus was crucified. Quran says that he wasn't. So where is this coming from? Well, if we go to Irenaeus, who was a 2nd century Christian author, in his book Against Heresies, he brings this up. Okay, very interestingly, he brings this up. So I'm just going to see now if we can quickly find it. If I'm not mistaken, it's here somewhere. Just give me 2 seconds. No. On board before he tries yes. So this is it, right? It's in section 4. By the way, you can check this in your own time. It's Against Heresies by Irenaeus, and it's book 1, chapter 24, and it's section 4. So in this particular, and by the way, Basilides is regarded as having, let's say, written this or narrative, whatever. Between, I think it's somewhere between like 120 AD and 140 AD, around there. So what was Basilides' view? Basilides argued that Jesus was not crucified, and his argumentation was that effectively Jesus, on the day when he was to be crucified, he transfigured himself in such a way that he would look like Simon of Cyrene, and then Simon of Cyrene would look like Jesus. So what ended up happening is that Simon of Cyrene ended up being placed on the cross, while Jesus kind of just stood there laughing at him, because he had kind of escaped effectively. Again, this is where this whole notion of substitution, it would seem, comes from, and that yet the Quran is borrowing from this concept, right? Because the historical view is that Jesus was crucified. The most attested view within the early church that was upheld by Christians was that he was crucified. The only people that countered this were apocryphal writers. But even those apocryphal writers, as we've already established in previous texts, they view Jesus as God. So, like, if you look into again, you can do this in your own time, but if you look into the views of Basilides on Jesus, Basilides was not a Muslim by any stretch of the imagination. He viewed Jesus as divine. So divine, in fact, that he couldn't be crucified. Because that was one of the main views within Gnosticism, which was that since Jesus was the kind of highest divine entity to ever come into creation, he could not have a physical body because they had a dualistic understanding of the world, that anything was physical was bad, anything spiritual was good. And therefore, with this theology in mind, they construct this narrative that he couldn't be crucified based on the fact that he was never in the flesh to begin with. But yeah, you can check these things in your own time. But again, the Quran seems to be pulling from that tradition, right? Which is very strange. So what was it? There was one other thing I wanted to quickly check. Yes. So this is in chapter 19 of the Quran, right? So in chapter 19, verse 30 of the Quran, Jesus declares from the cradle, he says, I am truly a servant of Allah. He has destined me to give the scripture and to be a prophet. Now, if you go to verse 33, it says, peace be upon the day I was born, the day I die, and the day I will be raised back to life. Whoops. I mean, that sounds like that verse made it into the Quran by mistake, because it seems like he's talking about the passion narrative. But anyway, that's besides the point. We'll leave that slide. Again, because it seems that the Quran is heavily redacted. As in, it's redacted these older texts. So where is he getting that from? So see this part here where Jesus refers to himself in the cradle as a servant of Allah. Well, believe it or not, this is actually taken from what's called the Arabic Syriac infancy gospel. Now, the Arabic Syriac infancy gospel was arguably a 5th/6th, well, I think it's a 6th century product. Again, this would have been just before the time of Muhammad. And since it was Arabic, it was obviously available in the region of Arabia. So it's like no wonder it finds its way into the Quran, right? But in the original, so this is before the time of the Quran, right? Listen to what Jesus says in the cradle in the original, right? He says, he says, I am the Jesus, Son of God, the Logos, to whom you gave birth, as Gabriel the angel announced you, sent by my Father for the salvation of the world. Now, in this, he says, I am the Son of God. In the Quran's adaptation of it, in its redaction of it, he just says, I am truly a servant of Allah. Now, given that the Arabic infancy gospel precedes the Quran in its production, he calls himself the Son of God, whereas obviously the logical pathway here is that the author of the Quran took that and he redacted it. He changed it, like he did with the other stuff. He changed it to just servant of Allah to fit his theology that, this child who is the Logos, the eternal word of God, the Son of God, now he's just a mere servant. Yes. So I just want to see if there was anything else that was worthwhile bringing up. If not, I can leave it at that. Yes, I think I'll leave it at that for now. So in conclusion, this is just something I've noticed, is that you have a huge reliance within the Quran upon apocryphal texts, particularly texts that were produced between the 1st century CE and the time of Muhammad, right? The point being that these texts which precede the Quran, they all have an origin in groups that were regarded as heretical, that were like, think of the one with the life of Adam and Eve, right? That one in particular is a sore one that appears in the Quran, because if that was the original narrative, why is there no mention of that anywhere before the first century, let's just say, because the belief is that we have we have a complete form of the Tanakh, the Old Testament, from the third century, found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, obviously, the Old Testament would have been, sorry, the Tanakh would have been produced before even then. That's just the earliest complete copy of it that we have. The point being that it would have been produced even before that time. Yet, um, in that version, in the original Tanakh, when you go to Genesis, it's the same Genesis narrative that we have today. And the belief is that that Genesis narrative is the same Genesis narrative that they would have had in the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th century BC, right? So my point being that if this Life of Adam and Eve apocryphal Jewish work that we know that was produced by an apocryphal Jewish sect, then why does it not appear before the first century, since Genesis was well in circulation as a text within the Tanakh before then? Something to think about. And why is the Quran only relying on stuff, realistically speaking, between the period of the first century CE and the 6th century CE? And why, on top of that, is it mostly apocryphal stuff, like the angel of death, right? Taken from the Apocalypse of Peter from the first century. Interestingly enough, in the original, Jesus is called God, right? Surah Al-Ma'idah, when it says that Jesus spoke from the cradle, in the original version, he calls himself the Logos and the Son of God, right? Jesus playing with the clay pigeons, right? Where is it? Yeah, so Jesus playing with the clay pigeons. In the infancy gospel of Thomas, as we saw in the two examples that I gave, Jesus is worshipped, right? So the point being here that it seems as if the Quran itself is ripping from these texts, and then whatever it's ripping from them, it's then redacting them to suit its theology, right? So if think of it this way, right? If Jesus has to be a prophet in order for Muhammad to fit, let's say, into Revelation, into his framework of Revelation, then it makes sense why this is happening, right? Because he has to change these things in order to make himself fit. He has to change the entire framework of, obviously, who Jesus is, because in the sense of the canonical Gospels, Jesus is the last. There's no one to come after Jesus, right? He is the final one that's sent effectively by God, but it is God incarnate, right? That comes. But putting that aside, there's none to come after Jesus. So if that's the final narrative and that's the framework that you're working with, of course you've no other opportunity or no other choice but to actually change the framework to suit your revelation and your theology to make yourself fit. So like that's why these texts seemingly in the Quran are redacted, right? Because in the originals, Jesus is worshipped. He's referred to as divine. He's referred to as God. The Quran rips them and then just changes them to suit their theology. So yeah, I'm just going to leave it there. Those are my concluding marks. Think about the stuff that's said and really, really consider, the points that were made, and ask yourself, is this really from God, or is perhaps, just look at it a bit objectively and say, well, maybe, given the truth of not just what I'm saying, but what scholars have said, what historians have said on these issues, then, because I will be doing a later stream focusing specifically in on the historical errors of the Quran, because there are historical errors within the Quran. But for the time being, I just wanted to demonstrate what the Quran seems to be. And I'll probably do more on this in the future. This could be just maybe a part 1 or something. So yeah.